The Desert Father is a man of power. Through the grace of God, he can foretell the future and at times even determine it. His power overwhelms the physical prowess of knights and surpasses the secular authority of kings. The illuminations in a 14th century manuscript of the Vitae Patrum, New York Pierpont Morgan Library manuscript M626, emphasize this truth, rendering visible the divinely granted power of the hermit saints. We see, for instance, Anthony's prophecy of King Balakius' death bear fruit on folio 20 recto, and watches John of Lycopolis ensures the victory of Theodosius' troops through his blessings. It is the holy man who defeats the cantankerous dragon that threatens the city, not the knights in armor who cower in the corner. In light of this established paradigm of Eremitic power and prestige, it is surprising to find the Desert Father lying prostrate before a nobleman at the bottom of folio 60 verso, taking the man's feet to his lips to kiss. The illustration, which accompanies the account of Emperor Theodosius's anonymous and unexpected visit to a Desert Father in the Verbum Sonorium, disrupts the heretofore clearly defined premise of power within the pictorial narrative of the manuscript. The Desert Father appears to have been made the subject of the worldly and profane. The Desert Father, something important here, obviously, is at stake. Indeed, the figure intended to represent Theodosius has been identified as King Robert of Anjou, based on the presence of heraldry, as well as physiognomic similarities to other depictions of the sovereign. Robert's presence complicates the narrative illustration. Not only is the otherwise established hierarchy subverted, but the sovereign's image is anachronistically grafted onto the illumination of a hermit saint who lived many centuries previously. Past and present collide, disrupting an otherwise fluid reading of text and image. Though arresting, even jarring, in the Morgan manuscript, representations of King Robert in the guise of significant personages were not unusual in the visual and artistic culture of Angevin Naples. Here, on the opening folio of Ecclesiastes in the Anjou Bible, Robert sits enthroned within the initial V, depicted as the wise Ecclesiastes. However, whereas in the Anjou Bible, the king sits as the embodiment of wisdom, the new Solomon, in the Morgan manuscript, the typological reference to Theodosius is only the first step in depicting the sovereign as a pious king. Through the uses of heraldic insignia and ruler typology, the illumination makes Robert both the subject and object of praise, a new Theodosius. It also encourages devotion to the Desert Fathers, an activity that could be achieved through reading the manuscript itself. Indeed, by reading the Morgan manuscript, Robert would have been able to perform the kind of piety he so clearly modeled within the illumination, visiting the Desert Fathers as Theodosius does in the text, and thus becoming like the late antique emperor in deed and virtue. Through his almsgiving, his collection of religious texts, his patronage of religious houses and theologians, and most notably his preaching, Robert sought to portray himself as a pious king. The Morgan manuscript sheds light on one way Robert endeavored to do so, by embodying and performing a sacred rulership through his readings of the lives of the Desert Fathers. Now, while the cryptoportrait, otherwise known as a disguised representation, has been mentioned in passing by scholars, serving at times as a means of dating the manuscript, there has been very little discussion of what the image implies about how the Morgan manuscript was used at Robert's court. Illustrating the kingdom of Naples around the year 1336, Morgan manuscript M626 A richly illuminated manuscript of the Vitae Patrum stands as witness and testament to the rise of the Eremitic ideal in late medieval Italy. Early scholarship on the Morgan's Vitae Patrum has considered the manuscript in terms of the style of its illustrations and dating, while more recent work has reflected upon the ways its illumination affected and informed late medieval devotion. And yet the illumination suggests that Robert was both the intended recipient and one of the intended readers of the manuscript. It places the Morgan manuscript within a cadre of manuscripts, and I just show you a few here, that evoked and amplified the highly cultivated image Robert sought to embody. The Morgan manuscript deepens our knowledge of how illuminated manuscripts help construct the Angevin king's identity by demonstrating how such manuscripts could reaffirm and amplify the sovereign's identity. They did so not simply by depicting the king's likeness, but also by guiding his devotion, enabling and encouraging him to perform the kingship he professed to embody. As we all know, reading in the later Middle Ages was a performative act in which identity could be constructed and projected. Images aided in the performance of identity by soliciting engagement and prompting the viewer to action. The Morgan manuscript is likely one of several manuscripts with which Robert performed his identity, either by reading the manuscript or at the very least by owning it. And here are some of those manuscripts. At a time when lay people and religious alike were gaining access to the practices of the desert saints by reading the lives of the desert fathers, the Morgan manuscript reveals how visual representations of the Eremitic ideal could be used for political ends. And yet it would be a mistake to see the illumination of Robert as purely political. The image itself calls Robert to contemplate the page and thus engage in an act of devotion to the Desert Fathers. It insists that the sovereign perform his sacred rulership, not just sit idly by and let it be represented. An emblematic king seeing Robert of Anjou and in the lives of the Desert Fathers. Now, a cursory glance at the figure of Robert on folio 60 verso does not reveal his identity. The figure wears no crown, and there is no insignia or heraldry displayed on this person that might allow for recognition. However, the figure's severe profile, with a strong, elongated nose, prominent chin, and grave, deeply outlined mouth, bears a striking similarity to other representations of King Robert, most notably those found in the manuscripts of the Primum Regia, which is here in London, the Anjou Bible, and of course, in Simone Martini's St. Louis of Toulouse altarpiece. Although there are problems inherent in identifying a historical figure based on a perceived physiognomic resemblance, the consistency in the visual representations of King Robert makes it evident that having an immediately identifiable artistic representation was critical to Robert's reign. In the Morgan manuscript, the identification of Robert does not rely solely on the representation of his physiognomic likeness. Heraldry helps as well. The Jerusalem cross, charged on the imperial banner, and the golden fleur-de-lis that crowns the flagpole refer to two distinctions specific to the Neapolitan house of Anjou. The Jerusalem cross is emblematic of the family's title as kings of Jerusalem, and the golden fleur-de-lis of the family's status as descendants of the Capetian royal line. Much like the heraldic insignia of Angevin Naples, the golden fleur-de-lis on a blue ground, these emblems of prestige allow for a secure identification of Robert within the narrative. They make the sovereign immediately and physically identifiable. and yet they allow for recognition in an otherwise enigmatic illustration. The insignia are not simply markers of identification. Through their ability as symbols to refer to Robert's connection to the kings of Jerusalem and the Capetian dynasty, the emblems also situate Robert within these lineages. The first sacred, the second dynastic. Through the insignia, Robert is portrayed as a Christian king in the line of David. Robert's connection to the biblical rulers of the Holy Land and the holy rulers of the Capetian dynasty establish his bona fides, as it were. With these represented, a convincing image of Robert as Theodosius can emerge. In the market miniature, the fleur-de-lis transverses the bands of the frame to call attention to its presence, a small punctuation amid a flurry of activity. Though diminutive in size in the illumination, the fleur-de-lis looms large in the constellation of images that portray Robert. The insignia of the Neapolitan House of Anjou, the fleur-de-lis saturated works associated with the sovereign. One has only to look to Simone Martini's panel painting of St. Louis of Toulouse, crowning Robert of Anjou, to see the accuracy of Julian Gardner's observation that Robert was a man for whom heraldry loomed large. In the painting, gilded fleur-de-lis project slightly from the blue ground of the frame, while the heraldic distinction is taken up again in the small fleur-de-lis punches that mark the edges of the panel painting. The fleur-de-lis is found in the crest on Robert and his sainted brother Louis' clothing as well, including the morse used to fasten Louis' coat. In the insistent, almost obsessive repetition of the lily, the Angevin dynasty is evoked like a musical refrain. The viewer is reminded again and again of the illustrious ancestry that Robert and his sainted brother share. When Charles I, Robert's grandfather, was crowned king of Sicily, he chose to adopt the Capetian lily as the Angevin royal insignia, as neither he nor his heirs were reluctant to proclaim their close ancestral links to the royal house of France. The lily was thus a point of reference and connection. In the St. Louis of Toulouse altarpiece, it emphasizes Robert and Louis' connection to the Capetian dynasty, from which the Neapolitan House of Anjou descended. But more importantly, like the action of Robert's sainted brother crowning him, the lily legitimizes Robert's right to rule through his evocation of beatisteps, dynastic saintliness. In the 14th century, the notion of sacred royalty was already backed by centuries of tradition in the form of the dynastic cult of saints. The Neapolitan Angevins, however, were the first ruling family to make the notion of dynastic saintliness the cornerstone of the sacral legitimation of their new dynasty. Looking to their saintly ancestors, the Angevin royal dynasty laid claim to a heritable sacrality. Robert's promotion of beatisteps can be seen most clearly in his sermons. In De Sanctis Ludovico per Sole et Ludovico Rege, one of Robert's many sermons exalting his brother, he calls his audience to, quote, consider the lilies of the field, end quote, a reference to the fleur-de-lis that dot the fields of both the Capetian and Angevin coat of arms. In the sermon, Robert suggests a sacred and royal connection between his brother and their illustrious ancestor, Louis IX, which is illustrated in their shared emblematic insignia. In his ingenious rumination upon the lily, Robert, never one to miss an opportunity for self-promotion, lauds the holy lineage that sacralizes his rule and those of his heirs. Implicit in his exaltation are his own ties to one of the greatest sainted kings of the 13th century, Louis IX. Through the shared emblem of the lily, it is not only St. Louis of Toulouse who is connected to the French king, but also Robert. While the fleur-de-lis calls forth Robert's dynastic ties to the Capetian dynasty, The Jerusalem cross, charged on the imperial banner, speaks to one of Robert's most cherished honorifics, his title as King of Jerusalem. In 1277, Charles I purchased the title to the King of Jerusalem with almost the certain intent to extend his newly won empire further east. These ambitions, however, were thwarted by the loss of the Sicilian Vespers and the subsequent fall of Acre in 1291. Although the House of Anjou no longer held any dominion over Jerusalem after the fall, the Jerusalem cross occupied as important a place within the sovereign's iconographical and ideological program as the fleur-de-lis. Indeed, the gold cross on a white ground is found frequently in tandem with the Angevin coat of arms. The title King of Jerusalem imbued the throne with legitimacy and authority. The association was especially significant because Robert was haunted by the specter of illegitimacy. Charles Martel, Robert's eldest brother, was the intended heir to the throne, but he died in the fall of 1295. The second eldest brother, the aforementioned Louis of Toulouse, was then considered. Yet late in 1295, he expressed his intent to become a Franciscan friar, as one does, and surrendered his claim to the throne. After Louis's abdication, there was only one other claimant to the throne, Charles's son, Cowalbert, but he was a young child and already heir to Hungary. As King of Jerusalem, Robert could portray his kingship as divinely ordained. He was fit to rule because, as the Dominican preacher and royal publicist Federico Franconi noted most vociferously, he was the Rises. Robert's positioning in the Illumination reflects a carefully cultivated image of the sovereign that is confirmed by the broader visual culture of Naples. Works such as the fresco Tree of Jesse in the Duomo in Naples suggest that the familiars and proponents of the king saw him as taking part in a long, prestigious lineage of holy kings. The Tree of Jesse in the San Paolo Chapel, which was commissioned by Umberto de Aumont, the French Archbishop of Naples from 1308 to 1320, and an ardent supporter of the Angevins, shows King David and King Solomon flowering from the trunk of a now damaged figure of Jesse. The biblical kings are followed in direct succession by another prophet, the Virgin Mary, and finally Christ. In the Tree of Jesse, the viewer sees the illustrious lineage of Christ rooted in the illuminated wisdom of David and Solomon. Originating from an iconographic tradition rooted in the 11th century, this and similar images of the Tree of Jesse focus the viewer's attention on Christ's connection to the Old Testament prophet and kings. At Chartres and Saint-Denis, the trees of Jesse portrayed in stained glass take on an even more important function. The visual counterpart of the Laudes Regia, chanted in honor of Capetian rulers, they serve as acclamations in their own right, analogical references to the Capetian sovereigns. Perhaps following in the tradition of its French counterparts, there is a connection between the Neapolitan House of Anjou and France. The Tree of Jesse in the San Paolo Chapel likewise adulates the ruling sovereign, Robert. Here, however, that exaltation is accomplished through an evocation of his likeliness. Crowned and holding orbs, David and the wise King Solomon are dressed in Byzantine-style garb. And just to focus your attention, I'm talking about these two figures. An orb and dalmatic stole, the figure of the king of Robert and the frontispiece of the Anjou Bible, resembles that of David and Solomon in the Tree of Jesse fresco. As Kathleen Fleck has argued, the similarities affirm that, quote, King Robert's court regularly likened him to the Old Testament kings of the Holy Land, and explicitly to the wise King Solomon. End quote. The visual similarities between the fresco and the illumination also add another dimension to the reading of the Tree of Jesse. Following the logic implied by the tree, we can see a powerful evocation of Robert dressed like David and Solomon as part of the king's sacral lineage. It is the insignia's capacity both to identify his bearer and to situate him within a lineage that allows an image of King Robert to emerge within the illumination on folio 60 verso. Robert's connection to the past is made evident. The fleur-de-lis and the Jerusalem cross gesture towards his place in a long succession of Christian kings, renowned for their piety. Through the bonds of consanguinity and fictive medieval historical typologies, Robert is connected to the pious kings of the Capetian dynasty and the biblical kings of Jerusalem. The insignia create a continuum that begins with David, continues with Louis IX, and leads to Robert. He follows in the tradition of holy rulers who are lauded for their wisdom and piety. It is only fitting, then, that he should be compared to Theodosius, another pious Christian king. While Robert's likeness and insignia ensure the sovereign's identification and present his bona fides, it is a reading of the narrative in conjunction with the illumination that allows a reading for Robert as Theodosius to emerge. The illustration is found in the section of the Morgan manuscript devoted to the Verbus Honorium, or the sayings of the Desert Fathers, a collection of aphorisms and anecdotes attributed to known and unknown hermit saints. The sayings are short biographical sketches and dicta that illustrate monastic virtues such as abstinence, humility, sobriety, obedience, renunciation of worldly goods, and silence. Somewhat surprisingly, given the panegyrical nature of the illumination, the illustration containing the crypto portrait of Robert extols the virtue of humility. In the anecdote, Theodosius, intrigued by an account of a hermit who has never left his cell, goes in search of the Desert Father. Meeting the hermit under the cloak of anonymity, the emperor learns how the Holy Fathers lead their lives in the desert. Ultimately, Theodosius chafes under the weight of anonymity and dispenses with his ruse. He adds to the disclosure of his identity a lament that he cannot lead a life of solitude like the Desert Fathers. Later, after Theodosius has departed, the Desert Father reflects upon his visit from the emperor and wonders whether he might lose his humility. Fearing that his virtue might be at stake, he flees, leaving his cell to find solitude and solace deeper in the desert. At the story's conclusion, the reader is encouraged to consider the value that the servant of God placed on the virtue of humility. The story of Emperor Theodosius and the Desert Father is explicitly intended to instruct its reader in humility. And yet the illustration does something different. It likens the sovereign Robert to Theodosius. The illumination depicts the retinue arriving at the Desert Father's abode, then transitions to showing Robert as Theodosius conversing with the Desert Father, and ends with the Desert Father's act of acknowledgement, supplication at the sovereign's feet. In the Morgan illustration, a comparison evoked by grafting Robert's likeness onto the figure meant to represent Theodosius casts Robert's behavior in terms of a Theodosian-like piety. The image of Robert as Theodosius stands within a tradition of ruler typology in which Old Testament kings and Christian emperors of late antiquity alike were evoked to characterize contemporary rule. Emperor Theodosius I, the Great, was repeatedly held up as an exemplar of ideal kingship to medieval rulers and mirrors of princes. In Augustine's City of God, a work frequently included in Mirror of Princes, Augustine praises Theodosius not only for his piety, faith, and humility, but for his formidableness as a lawmaker. The Carolingians, who heralded Theodosius as a model of ideal rulership, often likened their sovereigns to the late antique emperor. Both Louis the Pious and Charles the Bald were compared to the emperor during their reigns. In his biography, written by an anonymous astronomer, Louis the Pious is compared to Theodosius in his undertaking of penance and his willingness to publicly confess his sins. In one of the renowned ruler portraits of Charles the Bald, the Frankish king is explicitly likened to Theodosius in a titulus that reads, "When Charles sits crowned with great honor, he is like Hosea and equal to Theodosius." This evocation, as William J. Diebold has argued, calls to mind an image of Charles the Bald as the just ruler. But while Carolingian rulers evoke Theodosius in order to characterize their rule as just, Robert is represented as the late antique ruler to capitalize on the emperor's other great virtue, his piety. In the City of God, Augustine names two rulers who, in his opinion, were happy emperors, who made, quote, their power a servant to the divine majesty, end quote, and, quote, spread the worship of God far and wide, end quote. Theodosius is chosen because of his faith and piety in the face of great disadvantage and political despair. When plagued by anxious cares about the expanding power of his enemy, Maximius, he did not, Augustine notes with obvious pride, quote, go astray into wicked and forbidden superstitions, but instead sent to John, a hermit established in the desert of Egypt, end quote. Having learned that John was endowed with the spirit of prophecy, he consulted the desert father with great success. While this gesture might reek of a different kind of superstition to the modern reader, Theodosius' move to seek the counsel of the desert father, a servant of God, shows that rather than succumbing to pagan philosophies, he places his faith in the Christian God. Theodosius' trust in God, and in turn in the ascetic men of faith in the desert, is echoed and reaffirmed in the Birkbeck, wherein he visits the anonymous desert father. It is his faith and avid interest in the Aromatic saints that leads him into the desert in a type of imitatio of the desert father's journey into the vast wasteland. And it's perhaps the same devotion and idealization of the Aromatic saints that causes him to lament his inability to follow in their footsteps by living a life completely devoted to God. Though he cannot fully imitate the desert fathers, his wish to do so is evidence of a remarkable piety. In classic ruler typology fashion, the exemplar that Theodosius presents is shown to resonate with Robert's own expression of piety during his rule. The central event of the narrative, Theodosius' visit to an anonymous desert father outside Constantinople, likely alludes to an actual series of historical events. In